Okay, so how did you become interested in object-oriented ontology?
Um, I was reading about these new contemporary philosophers like Manuel de Landa and Graham Harman and Timothy Morton, and I realized that there is a certain trend in their mentality, way of thinking. You can even take this further back to Fernand Braudel. Um, they think of the world as one big whole with humans, with other living beings, with other inanimate beings in it, and they don't explicitly separate between humans and non-humans, or talk about a linear history of the world. And they think that everything is somehow interconnected. Uh, in uh, in Harman's words, everything is an object, whether animate or inanimate, fantasy or real, um, or a dream image. Thus, everything is an object, and everything affects each other. Um, Another philosopher, Tristan Garcia, says an object is a thing is um, the difference between what comprehends it and what it comprehends. And comprehension, he means not in a way that's kind of a conscious activity, but really kind of a physical or ontological comprehension. Thus, again, he defines things, he does not categorize things, but he defines things as this difference between being comprehended and comprehending. And this brought me to the subject of Hyperobject by Timothy Morton, where he has different parameters to define the hyperobjects. I mean, I won't go into detail, but due to their longevity, temporal undulation, complexity, interobjectivity, certain things like the global warming, like the weather, like the oil, um, could be considered as hyper objects, where they are kind of a system of objects, or even systems of systems within systems.
I was reading a recent article that was criticizing Timothy Morton on one level, because he says he doesn't clarify what can be actually considered a hyperobject. Then if everything can be a hyperobject, then what's the use of this philosophy? What's the practical thing we get from this classification? Well, I think it's a good question, and I don't think I comprehend it enough, let's say, to have an answer to this. But I think in general, even if it has some flaws, maybe because it's quite recent after all, it's still a quite mind-opening way of looking at the world, and
Yes.
might change the way we relate to nature or ourselves, or even lose these classifications altogether.
I think one of the major problems, and I think that's also the reason why you couldn't answer that question as well, is that these authors or these philosophers are dealing with hundreds of years of rooted philosophy, rooted understanding of very anthropocentric, very patriarchal constructions, ontological constructions, philosophical constructions, which has their own methodology, their own vocabulary. So you are trying to build up a new formation of ontology or philosophy, but you don't have the tools for them. So the tools, you have to invent the tools as well. And this is, I think, one of the reasons it is so difficult, for example, to understand Delanda's 1,000 years of nonlinear history, or Garcia's Form and Object, or Morton's Hyperobjects, or Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology. On one hand, you have to invent a new neology, new words, new terminology, but also you are trying to explain things or talk about things in an entirely different manner. Our brains are also fixed and fixated to certain ideas, to certain structures. And it doesn't matter how like open-minded we are. I mean, open-mindedness helps, of course, but you are also an open-minded person, and you have difficulties understanding their ideas. I'm an open-minded person, but I have difficulties understanding their ideas, because even this open-mindedness is within this archaic structure of thinking. It requires not an open-mindedness, but a change in mind, a transformation of perception and comprehension.
Well, as I understand it, according to Timothy Merton, these hyperobjects are already in our thinking. And actually, he says the reason why maybe he came up with this now, let's say, or why this new philosophy is emerging now, is because, in a way, the hyperobjects made it happen. It's like,
Okay.
I don't know, he talks about it like the Force in Star Wars, in a way. Like it's there, and it's like surrounding you, and by its presence and the fact that we're all submerged in it, they're making like us think. I mean, it sounds like God or whatever, but actually, it's just they're present even in our thinking, as I understand, according to him, like
Yes.
global warming, because it's just everywhere and on many levels, it's affecting our life.
Of course, when we are comparing these authors, but like one shouldn't think that they are on the same path, or making the same arguments and taking the same things. For example, although they are called the new materialists or speculative realists, kind of a broad term with a broad term, I am sensing that, for example, Delanda's problem is more with the history and the flow of history, and how the whole universe or the planet kind of transforms itself, and these flows of energy. For Harman, his problem is with the human-centeredness of the philosophy. How we, at a certain point in history, we have started to differentiate the human from the non-human, the animate from the inanimate, and construct this whole philosophy on top of it, where the human was in the center and the most important thing, the only conscious being in this world. So therefore, he kind of flattens the whole ontology to objects and starts from scratch, so to say. For Morton, I think he proposes kind of a new way of looking at the world, and probably sick with this scale blindness, these approaches of designers and architects and sociologists and psychologists or meteorologists to think of things as like separate entities and trying to solve problems on a micro scale. And he says that this thing you call climate is not like a city. It's not like a street. On a street, you can see a bump on the road and you can fix it. But with climate, it's so viscous, it's so everywhere, it's so interobjective that you cannot, let alone solve the problems about it. You cannot even comprehend it wholly. You only comprehend a part of it. You only comprehend a raindrop falling on your head, or you can only comprehend one phase of it. The weather is fine today, but the weather is only fine today. It's only a phase of it, and the weather is only fine today in Istanbul at that certain moment. The weather is much more bigger, wider, and complex than this.
Well, then that raises the question, if, like, let's say the weather or global warming is so huge and we can't even comprehend it, then does that mean we should just sit on our hands and say, okay, well, what will be, will be. And then what does it mean for designers or our design course? Because it could easily sound
yes, fatalistic and deterministic, yes. Although this is a very personal opinion of me, but I think some of the philosophers have realized that it's already too late to save ourselves, so to say, with precautions and certain solutions and so on. And they are preparing us for a calm, maybe, and subtle extinction, maybe in a couple of decades or 1 or 2 centuries, maybe. But as said, this is personal, and this does not affect the studio. But on a positive side, I mean, to use it in a pragmatic and optimistic way, I think we should first of all not focus on solely one philosopher or one idea, one thought school, so to say. Only Harman would be wrong, only Morton would be wrong, only Delanda would be wrong. But if we can come up with a plausible synthesis of all their arguments, then we might come up with more interesting and maybe more helpful so-called solutions or new, don't call them solutions, but maybe new arrangements of life, new arrangements of objects as designers. For example, our specific topic for the studio. Let's come to that. We said Bosphorus. We can see Bosphorus as a topographical place, or we can look at Bosphorus with its problems, but we can also see Bosphorus as a kind of an hyperobject because it contains many of the parameters. For example, Morton argues or puts for hyperobjects like the temporal undulation and phasing and interobjectivity. So if we see it as an hyperobject, as an object, as a system of systems, as a place where the energy, cultural, psychological, physical, biological energy transforms itself throughout hundreds and thousands of years, then this might provide us with a new understanding, with a new perspective, and then we might try to define that specific place, area, let's say, or object, with its entirety, and we can come closer to a comprehension. I don't think Morton says we cannot really comprehend objects or hyperobjects, but he says it is really difficult to comprehend them. And one last addition, maybe, many design studios tend to approach to their issues, to their topics, through anthropocentric perspective. Designers look at humans, look at problems, look at needs, and define certain things as problems and tries to solve them. Sometimes these are not humans, okay, in certain studios, but then it's again other living beings. We always tend to separate and categorize things and try to find some solutions for the problems. If we, keeping that in mind, if we combine these ideas of these philosophers, and many might be added to that as well, like maybe older, but Latour, thank you. We might see that all these things are interconnected, and you cannot deal with only one thing. You cannot deal with only one group of people's problems. Not anymore. I mean, that was the modernist mentality. The designer or architect finding solutions, finding the ideal, optimum living standards, living spaces or products or arrangements for all the human beings, right? And then their ideas were multiplied in many parts of the world. But we have witnessed that this didn't work. So we need a new approach. We need to synthesize maybe what we analyze too much in the past. We separated everything from each other. We categorized everything each other, and everyone looked at a specific thing and tried to solve problems in that area. But we have to bring them all together and think of them as a whole. If this case is the Bosphorus, we have to look at the currents. We have to look at the topography, architecture, seafaring, birds and fishes and human, and I don't know, flora and the fauna, and the weather, the climate, and we have to see how it all affects each other. We don't have to come with a solution because we are not superheroes. We will not save the world, let alone Bosphorus. But we might enhance our understanding of the world or of specific things as designers to be able maybe to solve to save a part of the world in the future.
Okay, so maybe in short, actually you're talking about, I think, like almost like a paradigm shift. So if we are talking about a paradigm shift in design, like that's a tall order, but let's, bring this back to earth a little bit. What does it all mean for the outcomes of the studio? Like what are we hoping to achieve at the end of these 14 weeks?
Come to the point, you say. Maybe we should play with the definition of design a little bit, as also many design researchers do in the recent years, in the last decade or decades, like Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, Arturo Escobar designing for the pluriverse, and many other practitioners, Tim Parsons and Jessica Charsworld, this speculative, fictional, or alternative types of designing for different worlds. By different worlds, I mean both worlds within this world and also imaginary worlds. I don't think we should get too much to the fictional side in this project, since it has certain definitions and restrictions. So we stay on our earth, but expand the definition of design to a collection, evaluation, presentation, and maybe representation of information about a specific thing, a specific object. So where do we begin? We begin with looking at the Bosphorus. What is it? Is it the towns at the Strait of Bosphorus? Is it the people? Is it the history, the fishes, the straits, and so on? Or is it the whole? Is there a specific issue about the Bosphorus that the student would like to engage more in? Then the research phase begins. We dug deeper. We do kind of like extraction of information from that specific topic issue. Then comes the issue of sampling. How do we collect this information, and how do we bring it all together in conceptually and physically? Then comes the question of presenting it. So you can acquire this information, but how do you communicate this information? You can communicate the information directly through numbers, or through raw data, or you can try to find ways of representing them in different ways. So I think this is where we come in, almost like curating an exhibition of information on Bosphorus. We help students to design representations, and by representations I mean objects or services to convey that information to common people, to everyone. This can be a collection of bird songs or chirpings, which can be found around Bosphorus, kind of a small toy for children to learn about the birds of Istanbul or Bosphorus. This can be a collection of botanical information about the Bosphorus in the form of an atlas, or a 3D book, unfolding book, or this can be a kind of an inspector's kit for collecting information, for sampling information from the Bosphorus. Or it can be a project of a small project of oral history of people living in and around Bosphorus, their stories and backgrounds and quotidian life. This maybe it's not right to talk too much about it. I mean, it's always good to imagine different types of projects, but we'll never know what we will encounter with, and the specific conditions of this term, this period, also make it difficult to define a very specific, well restrained and defined design project. So I would say we can leave it like this, but vaguely we can say we will have a research period where we look into things all together. Then we will have a kind of a design phase, either individually or in groups. We will help the students or work with students to develop their objects, designed objects, and then the last month, let's say 4 to 5 weeks, we will help them with the implementation of these ideas, how to bring them all together in a coherent way of exhibition or presentation.
Okay, I think that all sounds very exciting.
Yes, I think this is mostly sums up our approach to the studio. So what we need is just curious students, and also we might add maybe that since we will be we will be in Istanbul and we reside in Istanbul, we will supply them with all kinds of documentation if they are not they're not able to go to Bosphorus by themselves. We will like make short videos, sound recordings, photo documentation, and so on, to help them even remotely to work on the subject. And there are also lots of other published works on Bosphorus, information they can acquire. This is also very, very new for us, since we've never had this kind of a design studio before. But I think we will find kind of tailored projects maybe for each student or for each topic, and also help them to develop their own methodology for gathering information, and also coming up with a design proposal for this project.
And also, if we go back to the very beginning of our conversation and say, okay, maybe fictional objects are as real as real objects. So depending on somebody's topic, they could choose to look at I don't know, fictional characters living on the Bosphorus, or songs that depict the Bosphorus. I don't know. Or
yeah,
even...
well, I mean, that depends on how you define things. I mean, the songs about Bosphorus are also a thing for me. I wouldn't even say they are imaginary, because they are mostly based on real life experiences. People really did go out to see the moonlight reflection on the sea. But to propose kind of like fictional futures for the Bosphorus, that I think for that they have to wait for the next semester, where we...
No, what I mean is, like, it could be part of the research.
Exactly.
I think, if you're not able to travel to the Bosphorus, there are other ways to travel
Yes,
in time or in space.
That's also what makes it a hyperobject. Again, like Bosphorus, there's a separate Bosphorus in each of our minds, right? Like my experience with the Bosphorus, or Orhan Pamuk's experience with the Bosphorus, where they go cruising with their car and watching the fires of the houses along the Bosphorus, you know, or the Bosphorus in movies. Are they imaginary or not? So I think subject-wise, we can be quite flexible, but it all boils down to how you shape your presentation, that final proposal. This is very, very critical in this studio.
Okay, so we are looking at the Bosphorus now, at least, but the ways you choose to look can be quite varied, and the tools can even be specifically designed for the purpose.
Yeah, you can go back, starting from today. You can go back in history, and I don't mean the near history. Maybe some student will be interested how the Bosphorus was formed in the first place, how it came into existence. You know, how this strait of Mediterranean kind of like flew into the Black Sea pond back then. So I wouldn't put the restrictions on issues or subjects to cover, because the Bosphorus kind of defines that well. But I think we will put, and we will need to put, some restrictions on how to how to turn these things into design projects, which is much more difficult and requires expertise.
Okay, is that a good place to end?
Yes,
Do you think?
yes. So let's not bore our audience too much. That's pretty much sums it. If you have any questions, you can write to us. Buraya e-maillerimizi mi koyacağız? Billur. Güzel oldu. Billur.